Yeah, you wish. Hello, everybody. This video, or these two videos, are meant to replace what you are missing in class this week due to the holiday. And this first video is to replace my lecture, where I am going to talk just pretty briefly about kind of the basics of animation, what it is, which you probably already know, but then also to talk about some terms and so forth that will make our interface with Photoshop to create our GIF animation be a little bit more complete, if you will. So I'm going to start off by talking about those basics, and I'm going to show you a few videos from YouTube, very short. And then finally, I will talk about the next steps of Project 2, GIF Animation, so that you know what is going to be due for next week. The second video is going to be a demo of showing you how to build your GIF animation within Photoshop, and it's also going to be explaining what the in-class assignment is. Okay, so a quick slurp of coffee here, just so you can pretend like you are actually here with me now.
How about some coffee?
Okay!
Delightful. What you see on the screen in front of you, you may have seen before. It's a rather famous example of what I would consider to be the first animation. These photos were taken by Edward Muybridge, and it's a pretty interesting story. Back in the 1870s-ish, Muybridge got involved between two gentlemen who were placing a bet on whether horses' hooves were ever off the ground totally, all four hooves. Well, of course, this was a time when photography was brand new. They couldn't shoot a picture quick enough to capture that type of stop action. And so they just had their eyes to depend on, and our eyes can't stop action that fast either. And so they asked Muybridge to help them resolve this bet. And so he spent, I believe it was about 2 years, coming up with a series of cameras that were set up in a row at a racetrack. And they all had strings or wires attached to them so that when the horse ran by, it would trigger the camera to take a shot. So there were 12 cameras, and by this point he had figured out a way to shoot at a fast enough speed to actually stop the action at that particular point. So you can see the quality of the images isn't the greatest, but pretty amazing considering the time. And so basically it was determined that the gentleman who I believe was Stanford, the guy who actually Stanford University is named after, very rich guy, was who won the bet. All four of the horse's hooves are indeed off the ground in a few points when he is running, or she, as the case may be. Now, the bet is neither here nor there, but Muybridge's work continued, and he did many, I don't know if it's thousands, but at least many hundreds of different motion studies, where he studied not only animals, but he ended up studying the human form as well, both clothed and naked, doing all types of different activities and movements. And it's so that scientifically we could start to understand how the body moved. Pretty fascinating. But he did this with this same technology. In fact, if you do a search for Edward Muybridge, you will find all types of great visual examples. This really was the advent of filmmaking and animation, because filmmaking and animation are really the same thing. We aren't actually capturing an image moving. What we're doing is we're capturing a bunch of still shots shot in very quick succession of someone moving, but it's really just a bunch of still images right in a row. And so if I go here to this image, you will see that this represents something called frames per second, FPS. Very important concept. It's kind of the equivalent of pixels in Photoshop. The more pixels you have in an image, the higher the quality, the more detail it's going to hold. Well, same thing with frames per second. The more frames in a second, the better the quality of the film. And so what frames mean are still images. And so this, if we played this over the course of a second, this would be 12 frames per second. And so very important idea. Now, this is also what an animation is. So yes, our favorite movies, mine is The Godfather, which would be 30 frames per second. I love that, but it's not an animation, it's a movie. It's meant to represent real life as if it's been captured. Well, animation is all about creating your own reality. So that's what you're going to be doing in your GIF animation. Now, each of these would be called keyframes. Keyframes you may be very well familiar with, but in traditional animation, such as we saw at the very beginning there with Porky Pig, they would be hand-drawn. And so in the world of animation, when things were hand-drawn, and I'm sure it's still true today, there are the primary animators. In Looney Tunes' case, my favorite time period was the animations that Chuck Jones directed. And so he would often be the head animator on a job. Well, he wouldn't draw every single frame in the animation because there's thousands and thousands of them. But he would draw the primary keyframes. In other words, primary points in the action that are important to distinguish very specifically. Then he would have a bunch of junior animators that would go in and create what are called the in-between frames, also known as tweens. So we will talk about those in Photoshop in a couple of weeks. But for right now, we're just going to be concerned with the keyframes, primary points in the action. Now, here's something from my early childhood. This is Gumby, and these were the weirdest animations you've ever seen in your life. This was stop action, where basically you have a posable character. Think of Wallace and Gromit, say. And you very carefully move them into position, take a picture, move them a tiny bit more, take another picture, etc. So stop action is another form of animation, one which you may choose to do for your GIF animation. But Gumby is a very good example of that. I do believe the creators of this actually were on drugs when they created these. Incredibly bizarre, but as a child, I loved them. Thank you. So those are some important concepts. The idea of frames per second, keyframes, primary points in the action, and then following this, you can get more in depth to kind of the theories of animation. So obviously the king of all animation is Disney, right? Walt Disney. And if you go back to the early films, Snow White being the first feature-length animated film, that was made in the 30s. It's pretty amazing, the quality of that. And when you think about the amount of work that went into drawing each and every one of those frames, and then painting each and every one of those frames, and then photographing each and every one of those frames. Now from Disney came a series of animators kind of trained by and working with Walt over many years, that were called the Grand Old Men of Disney, or the Grand Old Men of Animation. A couple of them wrote a book that broke animation down into 12 basic principles. And so what I want to do now is show you a few short videos. These are on YouTube. Let me just show you the page. And again, this link is under the 380 links page. I'm just going to show you like 5 of these today, talking about some of the basic principles of animation. So even though we are not doing traditional animation, so these principles maybe won't be directly applied to your animation, but some of these ideas might, because they all have to do with timing and the idea of making the movement you're creating be more believable and more realistic. Okay, I'm going to show you these movies one after the other. They are called Squash and Stretch, Anticipation, Slow In and Out, Arcs, and then finally, my favorite, Exaggeration. Let the show begin.
Hey guys, so I decided to make a video series dedicated to the 12 principles of animation, as described by the legendary animators Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston. So the first principle is squash and stretch. This is the principle that animated objects will get longer or flatter to emphasize their speed, momentum, weight, and mass. Here's a bouncing ball that has squash and stretch. And here is one without squash and stretch. See the difference? The amount that an object squashes and stretches says something about its mass. The more squash and stretch, the softer the object. The less squash and stretch, the stiffer the object. This first one looks like a water balloon, and the second one probably would be a bowling ball. Squash and stretch applies to characters too. Look at how this figure is stretching from the speed that he's coming down with, and then he squashes after he lands, before settling in his pose. You can also use squash and stretch to exaggerate facial expressions. Let's add some squash and stretch to this face. When his eyes are closed, his face is squashed, and when he opens his eyes in disbelief, his face stretches up and settles back to normal. It's very important to keep the volume of the object consistent. This is what a lot of people mess up with when they're first trying to do squash and stretch. They'll elongate the ball like this and flatten it like this. This is what you should not do. The overall volume of the ball must be the same. So as the ball gets longer, it also gets narrower. When it gets flatter, it also gets wider. The same goes with cubes. If you're going in with one line, the other lines must go in the opposite direction. The cube should start out narrow, get flat, get narrow again, and then rest. In-betweening with cubes is easy because you can measure the line in between the two lines and then connect them to make the cube. If you master squash and stretch with cubes, the next step is to try to do it in 3D. Another important note is that the ball does not have to be stretching the entire time that it's falling. When it's just starting to fall, it should have its normal shape for the most part. And then when it's just about to hit the bottom, that's when it has the most stretch. So do not overdo squash and stretch in this sense. Alright, that is all I've got for squash and stretch. The next principle will be anticipation. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Alright, the second principle of animation is called anticipation. This is when a character prepares for an action to give the audience a clue as to what is happening next, as well as to make the action appear more realistic. One example is when a character is about to jump. Before leaping into the air, he has to prepare for the action by crouching down to build energy. It's like a spring that coils up before releasing. Look at this character jumping without any anticipation. It looks very unrealistic because the energy to jump comes out of nowhere. Here's another example. A punch. To add power to the punch and communicate to the viewers that he is about to punch, he reaches his arm back and then punches. By contrast, having no anticipation results in a very weak punch. You'll see this in a lot of cartoons. Before running, a character will wind up before taking off. In the previous video about squash and stretch, this face actually uses anticipation as well. Instead of immediately stretching up, the face squashes first to anticipate the stretch and give it more power. Anticipation helps communicate actions to the audience by preparing them for the next action. This can happen in many ways. If a character is about to take something out of their pocket, they make their hand very visible and up in the air before going into the pocket. Otherwise, the audience might miss it and wonder how they got that object in the first place. The most important thing is that the viewer notices the hand and the pocket, so the character cannot be performing any competing actions. Let's say that something's about to happen on the right. A character may prepare for that action by pointing their eyes and head to look in that direction, leading the viewers to also look there. It's important to make it as easy as possible for the audience to understand what's going on without having to watch it twice. But this can also be used to trick the audience too, if you lead their eyes in one direction and then surprise them by having something happen on the other side of the screen. Taking anticipation a step further, you can actually have multiple levels of anticipation. Let's go back to our punch animation, where the character winds up before punching. This animation has one level of anticipation. Now look at this one. The character is actually winding up for his wind-up by going forward, then winding up, and then before punching, he throws his other arm back to further anticipate the punch. This punch is very complex. It's actually similar to what a baseball pitcher does when he's getting ready to throw the ball. Alright, that's all I've got for anticipation. The next principle is called slow in and slow out. This principle refers to the way pretty much all movement starts slowly, builds speed, and finishes slowly. This is one of the most important principles to achieving lifelike motion. Without slow in and slow out, things feel mechanical. That's because robots are one of the only things that actually move their parts at a constant speed. To use this principle in 2D animation, you take your extreme poses, draw a single in-between, and then draw in between those, then only in between the drawings closest to the extremes until you're satisfied with the amount of slow in and slow out. With 3D animation and motion graphics, Adding slow in and slow out is a matter of changing the motion curves from linear to spline by adjusting the Bezier handles. As time progresses, the object starts slow, gets fast, and ends slowly. Use it wisely. For example, you wouldn't add a slow out to a bouncing ball as it's colliding with the ground, but you would add it as it's bouncing back up. You wouldn't add it to a bullet coming out of a gun, but you would add it as the gun comes up due to whiplash. Using this principle can allow you to only have to draw one in-between if the motion is quick enough. Draw one in-between and then add another frame on either end with the drawing slightly skewed in the correct direction, and then it's done. Sometimes you don't even have to add the one in-between. This kind of motion can be achieved in 3D with very extreme curves. Many people starting out with animation get impatient and draw the next frame very far away from the beginning. It's very unrealistic for a character to go from completely still to super fast, so adding a few drawings to ease into it will fix the problem. A good way to fix a choppy animation is to analyze the space between the drawings. They should be evenly spaced, with drawings closer together at the beginning of the action and at the end of the action, and drawings farther apart in the middle. So that's it for slow in and slow out. Alright, the seventh principle of animation is called arcs. So very few organisms are capable of movements that have a mechanical in and out or up and down precision. Most living creatures will move in a circular path, otherwise known as an arc. So let's say that we were given these key poses and were told to fill in the poses in between. Simply taking the midway point between the poses will not work, because this looks way too mechanical. The ball needs to follow an arc. Of course, we also need to consider the slow in and out caused by gravity. When doing this in 3D and motion graphics, we can achieve this effect by keeping the movement in the x-axis constant, but giving the movement in the y-axis a slow in and slow out. This will give the ball its arc. Now let's look at this head turn. Right now it looks pretty dull and straight, but if we add an arc to it, it gives it a little bit more character. Forgetting about arcs can lead to some obvious mistakes. For example, we may in-between this movement by calculating the midpoint like this and cause the shape of the object to shrink. If we were to draw a simple arc as reference, then this movement would be a lot easier and more realistic. Arcs can be added to almost any figure movement. This guy is landing on the ground. Let's have his body settle in an arc. This guy is reacting with shock. Let's have his body and arms follow an arc. This guy is taking a step. Have his body move down and up in an arc before he even takes his next step. This guy is kicking. Have his leg and body follow through in an arc. When movements are very fast, you can add arcs in the form of a smear. Take the beginning and end pose and draw an arc in between and fill it in the same color as the object, maybe slightly transparent or fragmented towards the end of the action. So that's it for arcs. So the next principle is called exaggeration. Basically, every action, pose, and expression can be taken to the next level to increase the amount of impact on the viewer. So the early animators at Disney would get confused because Walt would tell them to add more realism, but then when they changed it, he would criticize the result because it wasn't exaggerated enough. In Walt's mind, there was probably no difference. Making it more realistic didn't mean make the physics and proportions more consistent with reality, but rather make the idea or essence of the action more apparent and real. So if a character was sad, make him sadder. Bright, make him brighter. Worried, make him more worried. Wild, make him wilder. Exaggeration doesn't mean more distorted, but more convincing. It's amazing how you can always add exaggeration. This animation looks finished, right? But let's give it some exaggeration. Now when we compare the two, the first one definitely looks less powerful, even though earlier we thought it was finished. When motions are quick, the exaggeration needs to be bigger in order to be noticed. This still frame looks way too extreme to be realistic, but when you play it in motion, it looks less extreme. That's because a lot of the frames that your eye perceives in a short time are less extreme frames, and only one of them is very extreme. So in order to boost its presence, you can either make it stay on screen longer, or make it more extreme. Since it's hard to tell how much room you have for exaggeration, a good rule to follow is to push the exaggeration level until it actually becomes too much. Then wind it back until you're satisfied with it. This way you see the whole range beforehand, instead of shooting in the dark.
So I hope you enjoyed those videos. Obviously, it's not apples to apples with what we're doing, but you are going to be dealing with time passing and movement, and you may want your movement to be more realistic or more exaggerated so that people understand your point better. So hopefully those videos will help you understand methods you can use to get there. And I did show you just 5 of those, so know that there are 7 others. So if you enjoyed those and you want to watch the rest, just follow the link. So here we are, back in the Project 2 project sheet, and I want to talk about what the next 2 steps of the project are going to be. So we're up here at the top, point number 3. We're going to create a storyboard next, and you actually saw my example storyboard in class this last week, but here it is again down here in the lower right corner. And so what a storyboard is it's really just a series of your keyframes showing the most important points of action within your animation. So mine, I'm not going to show you my example. You can see my example by going to the website. And you're going to realize that what I did was I wrote a novel when I was asked to create a short story. It's very long for a GIF animation, and it's trying to tell way too much of a story. So I don't recommend you follow my lead. I haven't made a new one because I think it's a good example of what not to do. But all that said, this is the storyboard I created when I was working on that project. So you can see my storyboard, besides being fairly crudely drawn, is really pretty basic in terms of what it's showing, and it's just walking you through the basic points of the action where something of significance changes. Once you've done that, and you can just, same way you did with your roughs that were due this week, this isn't a drawing class. Draw it as well as you can, make notes as necessary so that I understand what you've drawn, and just basically use this as a tool to help you figure out the artwork which you're going to need to create or to find. And that is the second part, step 4. So once you've got your storyboard, you've figured it out, you know how you want to produce this, whether it's photography or hand drawing or finding images on the internet or elsewhere, then you need to start creating the art for each of those individual keyframes that are indicated in your storyboard. So what's going to be due next week are the storyboard and the artwork for each of the frames. However, you do not have to have the animation started. You just need to have the artwork for the animation completed. And so then the idea is that over the next week, after next class, then you will be able to build your animation. And then in next week in class, I'm going to show you how to put that into a web page, and we're going to start using Dreamweaver, which is pretty cool. So storyboard, step number 3. Step number 4 is to create the artwork for each of your frames in your animation, and that can be an Illustrator file, it can be a Photoshop file, it can be a collection of separate images, but you are going to turn all this in a zip file uploaded to Canvas, and there will be a turn-in link under week 4 for that. And so for you guys, that'll be due Monday, September the 14th, and it's worth 10 points, so definitely worth spending the time on. And the good news is that if you have all that done, you meet the deadline and you're ready to go, then creating your animation, as you'll find out in the demo video, is not really very hard at all, and you can make pretty quick work of that. So anyway, that's it for kind of the Project 2 overview. In the next video will be the demo showing you how to create a GIF animation, and then what my expectations are for you to do for the quote-unquote in-class assignment that will be due next week also. So all right, see you in the next one.